They told her to scrap it. The billionaire CEO, standing in freezing sleet, was told her 30-year-old car was garbage. "Just buy a new one," the dealership manager laughed, pointing at his glittering showroom. They didn't know what was hidden inside the rusted chassis. They didn't know the vehicle was the only thing keeping her tethered to reality. But a mechanic, a single dad with grease under his nails, popped the heavy steel hood. And what he found silenced the entire room. The engine didn't die with a dramatic explosion. It suffocated. Vivian Taylor felt the shudder travel up through the cracked rubber of the steering column, a sickly, rhythmic thudding that resonated in her molars. The dashboard of the 1990 Volvo 240 estate lit up like a cheap Christmas tree. Oil pressure, battery, check engine. The analog speedometer needle spasmed, dropping from 40 down to 0. Outside, the November sleet came down in sharp diagonal sheets, hammering against the windshield, faster than the sluggish wipers could drag them away. Vivian wrestled the heavy, suddenly unassisted steering wheel, muscling the dying 2-ton brick onto the gravel shoulder of the coastal highway. The car rolled to a halt. A heavy hiss leaked from beneath the hood, followed by the acrid metallic smell of boiling coolant and scorched wire. Silence swallowed the cabin, save for the rain. Vivian sat still. She didn't reach for her phone. She didn't cry. She just stared at the dashboard clock, its digital green numbers frozen at 11:42 p.m. She was 41 years old. Her net worth, as of the market close that afternoon, was $1.8 billion. She owned a logistics empire, a penthouse in the city, a private jet hangar, and a fleet of matte black SUVs driven by men wearing earpieces. Yet she was wearing a faded grey college sweater, sitting in a car that smelled like damp wool and stale peppermint, gripping a steering wheel patched with duct tape. Every year on the anniversary of the night, she was evicted from her apartment. At 22, Vivian drove this car. It was a grounding ritual, a brutal reminder of the cold. Tonight, the cold had won. By the time the flatbed tow truck dropped her and the steaming Volvo off at the nearest open service center, Vivian's feet were numb. Water dripped from the hem of her wool coat. The tow driver had deposited them at Apex Motors, a high-end import dealership with a 24-hour service bay. The building was a monolith of floor-to-ceiling glass, brushed steel, and LED lighting that burned with a sterile surgical white glare. Walking into the service reception area felt like stepping into a hospital waiting room for the obscenely wealthy. The floor was covered in pale, polished porcelain tiles. A faint scent of espresso and artificial citrus masked the usual garage smells of oil and exhaust. A service manager stood behind a marble-topped podium. His name tag read, Bryce. He wore a tailored slim-fit suit that looked too tight across the shoulders, and his hair was gelled into a hard, glossy helmet. He didn't look up from his tablet when Vivian approached. "Drop-offs are by appointment, ma'am," Bryce said, his voice a flat, practiced drone. "Unless you're under the Apex Care warranty program." Vivian left wet footprints on the pristine floor. "I need a mechanic. It died on the highway." Bryce finally looked up. His eyes dragged over her soaking wet hair, her un-makeup-covered face, her damp, oversized coat. Then he looked past her through the massive glass wall that separated the reception area from the rain-swept lot. Sitting on the tarmac, looking like a rusted brick dropped amidst a sea of sleek, aerodynamic luxury sedans, was the Volvo. A puddle of dark fluid was already pooling beneath its front axle. Bryce's mouth twitched, a micro-expression of absolute disgust. "Is that yours?" "Yes." "Ma'am, we service high-performance European imports. We don't operate a salvage yard." Vivian felt a familiar cold weight settle in her chest. It was the same feeling she used to get 20 years ago when bank tellers looked at her overdrawn account slips. She could have pulled out her black card. She could have bought the entire dealership, fired Bryce, and turned the building into a parking garage for the Volvo. But the sheer exhaustion in her bones weighed her down. "It's a European import," Vivian said, keeping her voice entirely flat. "And it's not salvage, it just needs a diagnostic." Bryce sighed a heavy, theatrical sound. He tapped his perfectly manicured fingernail against the tablet. "Look, I'll humor you. But I can tell you right now that thing is a biohazard. It's bleeding oil onto my lot." He turned his head and shouted toward the pristine, brightly lit service bays in the back. "Hey, Kyle, bring the OBD scanner out to the lot. We've got a dinosaur." Kyle was 20-something, wearing a spotless blue uniform that looked like it had never touched motor oil. He carried a sleek wireless diagnostic tablet, like a clipboard. He flanked Bryce as they walked out into the freezing drizzle. Vivian followed, pulling her collar up against the wind. Kyle walked a circle around the Volvo, his boots crunching on the wet asphalt. He didn't touch the car. He looked at it, the way one might look at a dead animal on the side of the road. "Where's the port?" Kyle asked, frowning. "It doesn't have an OBD2 port," Vivian said, shivering. "It's a 1990. It has a primitive diagnostic box under the hood. You have to read the blinking LED lights." Kyle stared at her. Bryce snorted. "You want my master tech to count blinking lights? I want him to open the hood," Vivian said, her voice dropping an octave. The billionaire was starting to bleed through the exhausted shell, the tone of a woman used to ending boardroom arguments with a single sentence. Kyle reluctantly popped the hood. The metal screamed on dry hinges. A fresh wave of acrid steam rolled out into the rain. The engine bay was a mess of grease-oxidized metal and 20 years of accumulated road grime. Kyle shined a harsh LED flashlight into the dark, tangled cavity. He didn't reach his hands in. "The block is covered in sludge," he said, stepping back quickly, as if the dirt might jump onto his uniform. "Coolant reservoir is bone dry. Smell that's fried wiring. The main harness is probably melted together. It's a catastrophic thermal event." "Can you fix it?" Vivian asked. Bryce laughed. It was a short, barking sound. "Fix it, lady. Even if we could source parts for a car that belongs in a museum, the labor hours alone would run you $5,000. The car is worth maybe $500 in scrap metal. It's totaled." "I didn't ask what it was worth," Vivian said, staring Bryce dead in the eyes. "I asked if you could fix it." "No," Bryce said, entirely devoid of empathy. "I'm not tying up one of my bays for 2 weeks on a rusted-out shitbox. Leave the keys. I'll call a scrapper in the morning to haul it off. Do yourself a favor. Walk into the showroom right now. I can get you approved for a certified pre-owned sedan. Buy a new car." Vivian looked at the Volvo. Through the rain-streaked window, she could see the back seat. The upholstery was ripped. That was where she had slept for 4 months. That was where she had coded the algorithm that launched her first company, typing on a stolen laptop plugged into the cigarette lighter. To Bryce, it was trash. To her, it was the only monument to her survival. "Don't touch it," Vivian whispered. "Excuse me," Bryce sneered. Before Vivian could respond, the heavy glass door of the service center pushed open. A man stepped out into the rain. He didn't belong in the gleaming Apex Motors dealership. He wore heavy canvas work pants, stained dark at the knees, and a thermal Henley shirt. His boots were scuffed leather, thick with grease. He looked to be in his late 30s with dark, unkempt hair plastered to his forehead by the rain. His knuckles were heavily scarred black oil, permanently tattooed into the deep creases of his skin. He held a small cardboard box of parts in one hand. Tugging at his other hand was a little girl, maybe 7 years old, wearing a puffy pink jacket that was slightly too small for her. She had a tablet in her hands and looked half asleep. "Hey, Bryce," the man said. His voice was a low, gravelly rumble that cut right through the sound of the rain. "You charged me retail for a wholesale oxygen sensor." Again, Bryce rolled his eyes. "Take it up with the parts counter tomorrow, Dean. I'm dealing with a situation here." Dean Gallagher didn't walk away. His eyes shifted from the slick service manager to Vivian in her soaked clothes, and finally to the steaming open hood of the Volvo. He didn't look at the car with disgust. His eyes narrowed, analyzing. He let go of his daughter's hand. "Maya, stay under the awning. Keep your boots dry." The little girl nodded, stepping under the glass overhang and leaning against the brick wall, totally unfazed. Dean walked toward the Volvo. "Hey!" Bryce snapped, stepping into Dean's path. "Back off, Gallagher. This isn't one of your shady mobile repair jobs. The customer is dealing with me." Dean didn't stop. He just kept walking, forcing Bryce to step aside or get shouldered into the puddles. Dean stopped next to Vivian. He smelled like brake-cleaner old coffee and wet canvas. It was a harsh, industrial scent, but compared to Bryce's cloying cologne, it smelled incredibly honest. "He tell you it's a catastrophic thermal event?" Dean asked Vivian, not looking at her. His eyes fixed on the engine bay. Vivian blinked, taken aback. "Word for word." Dean let out a dry, humorless breath. "Yeah. They learned that phrase in a corporate seminar." "Sounds expensive, doesn't it?" He pulled a small, incredibly bright penlight from his pocket and bit it between his teeth. Without hesitation, he plunged his bare hands into the steaming, greasy cavity of the engine. "Gallagher, I'm warning you." Bryce snapped his voice shrill over the sleet. "You touch a vehicle on my lot, I'll have you trespassed. Kyle, go call security." Kyle, the spotless master tech, hesitated, looking between his angry boss and the broad-shouldered man, currently shoulder-deep in the smoking Volvo. A few other mechanics, drawn by the yelling, began to filter out from the brightly lit garage bays, gathering under the overhang. They watched like spectators at a blood sport. Apex Motors mechanics hated Dean. He was a bottom feeder to them, a guy who operated a rusty tool truck and stole the low-income clients they didn't want anyway. Dean ignored them all. The rain plastered his shirt to his back, but he didn't seem to feel the cold. "Give me a crank," Dean mumbled around the flashlight in his mouth. Vivian stared at him. Dean pulled the flashlight out. "The key. Turn the key. Let me hear what it's doing." Vivian didn't wait for Bryce's permission. She pulled open the heavy driver's side door, slipped into the damp driver's seat, and turned the ignition. Click. Whirr. Clunk. Dean's head popped up from behind the hood. "Again. Hold it for 3 seconds." Vivian turned it again. The engine whined a high-pitched, grinding squeal, followed by a harsh, metallic slapping sound. "Stop!" Dean yelled. He wiped a streak of black grease across his forehead with the back of his wrist. He peered deeper into the engine bay, shining his light down toward the firewall. Bryce scoffed loudly, playing to the small crowd of technicians watching from the dry pavement. "See spun bearing. Dead starter. The wiring harness is actively melting. The ECU is fried. You're wasting your time, Gallagher. The computer says it's dead." "The computer," Dean said softly, his voice dripping with venom. He didn't look at Bryce. He reached deep under the intake, manifold his forearm pressing against the hot metal. He hissed as a burn welted on his skin. But he didn't pull away. "You guys plug in a tablet, and if the tablet can't read it, you throw the whole machine away. You don't know how to listen to metal anymore." Dean pulled his hand out. In his fingers he held a thick, severed bundle of wires wrapped in melted black tape. Bryce smirked. "Like I said, melted harness. Good luck finding a replacement." Dean didn't say anything. He dropped the melted wire. He reached into his deep canvas pockets and pulled out a simple, red-handled multi-tool. He flipped open a small wire stripper. Vivian got out of the car, standing close to the fender, watching his hands. They were violently rough hands, scarred from 1,000 slips of a wrench. But the way they moved inside the engine bay was shockingly delicate. "What did you find?" Vivian asked, her voice barely a whisper over the rain. Dean looked up at her. The cynical hardness in his eyes softened for a fraction of a second. "You ran over something. A branch, maybe a piece of tire tread on the highway." "I hit a pothole about a mile back, a deep one." "That'll do it," Dean muttered. He pointed his penlight down into the dark abyss of the engine block. "Your motor mounts are original. They're rubber. After 30 years, rubber turns to dust. When you hit that pothole, the entire engine block jumped upward by about 3 inches. Kyle, the young tech, laughed nervously. "So that doesn't cause a thermal event." Dean finally turned his head and glared at Kyle. The sheer weight of his stare made the younger man step backward. "No, but when the engine jumped, it pinched the main grounding strap against the exhaust manifold, ripped it right off the chassis. When a car loses its ground, the electricity panics. It looks for any path it can find back to the battery." Dean shined his light on the severed, melted wires he had just dropped. "It found your coolant temperature sensor wire, sent a massive surge through it, melted the plastic, boiled the coolant in the line, and shut off the fuel pump to save the engine." Bryce crossed his arms. "Whatever. It's still a fried electrical system." "No," Dean said. He reached down and yanked the melted bundle of wires completely out. He tossed it onto the wet pavement at Bryce's expensive leather shoes. "It's a dead sensor. The car doesn't need it to run." Dean pulled a thick, braided copper strap from his pocket, a spare battery ground he clearly carried for odd jobs. He reached blindly under the engine block. The sound of a ratchet clicking echoed rapidly in the rain. Tick, 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 tick. He tightened the bolt by pure muscle memory. He stepped back. He looked at Vivian. "Turn it." Vivian climbed back into the car. Her hand was shaking slightly as she gripped the key. She turned it. The starter engaged. It cranked once, twice, and then the heavy cast-iron engine roared to life. It idled high, blowing a thick cloud of white exhaust out of the tailpipe, but the rhythmic knocking was gone. It smoothed out into a deep, steady industrial hum. The dashboard warning lights instantly vanished. Under the awning, the crowd of Apex technicians fell dead silent. Bryce's mouth opened, but no sound came out. He looked at the idling engine, then at Dean, completely humiliated. Dean wiped his hands on a greasy shop rag. He didn't gloat. He didn't even look at Bryce. He walked over to the driver's side window. Vivian rolled it down. The heater was already blowing warm air into her face, smelling faintly of dust and salvation. "You need a new ground cable," Dean said, his voice flat. "And your motor mounts are shot. But it'll get you home." Vivian stared at him. For the first time in 10 years, she didn't know what to say. "How much do I owe you?" Dean looked away, his eyes tracing the rusted edge of the car door. Then his gaze caught on something inside the cabin. He saw the duct tape on the steering wheel. He saw the aftermarket toggle switch, poorly wired under the dashboard, a bypass switch. Dean stopped wiping his hands. He leaned closer, staring at the messy clump of exposed wires near the ignition cylinder. "Who wired this bypass?" Dean asked, his voice suddenly thick, a strange tension bleeding into his tone. "I did," Vivian said defensively. 20 years ago." Dean stared at the wires. Then he looked at Vivian's face. He really looked at her. Past the expensive wool coat, past the exhaustion. His eyes widened slightly, a flicker of shock that he immediately tried to mask. "You used copper speaker wire," Dean said quietly, so the mechanics couldn't hear. "And a spring from a ballpoint pen to jump the relay." Vivian's breath hitched. "How do you know that?" "Because," Dean said, his jaw tightening. "I was the guy who told you how to do it. 20 years ago, in the parking lot of the 4th Street Women's Shelter." The rain seemed to stop making a sound. Vivian's heart slammed against her ribs. She stared at the mechanic, peeling back the lines of age, the grease, the heavy beard. "Dean," she whispered. Dean took a step back, the rag tight in his fist. He looked at the billionaire CEO, then down at his own oil-stained boots, a profound wave of shame and disbelief washing over his face. "Get home safe, Viv," he muttered, turning his back on her and walking away into the rain. The Volvo's heater blasted dry, stale air into Vivian's face. It smelled of heated dust and the faint, sweet tang of old antifreeze. She sat frozen behind the wheel, her hands gripping the duct-taped steering rim so hard her knuckles ached. Viv. No one had called her that in 2 decades. To the world she was Vivian Taylor, the untouchable titan of supply chain logistics. To the board she was a calculating machine. But 20 years ago, she was just Viv, a terrified 22-year-old girl hiding in the back seat of this exact car, behind a battered women's shelter, trying to figure out how to start a broken engine so she could sleep with the heat on. And Dean Gallagher had been the scrawny 20-something kid fixing the shelter's water heater for minimum wage. He had found her crying in the front seat. He hadn't judged her. He hadn't asked questions. He had simply handed her a ballpoint pen, stripped a piece of speaker wire with his teeth, and showed her how to bypass a dead ignition relay so she wouldn't freeze to death. Through the rain-streaked windshield, Vivian watched Dean's broad back as he walked away. He was moving fast, his shoulders hunched against the sleet. He reached a battered, rust-eaten 2004 Ford F250 parked at the far edge of the lot, well away from the dealership's gleaming inventory. He opened the passenger door, lifting the little girl in the pink jacket inside, then slammed it shut. A sudden, violent spike of adrenaline snapped Vivian out of her shock. The billionaire pragmatism, the instinct that had built an empire out of nothing, overrode the numbness in her chest. She wasn't going to let him walk away. Vivian threw the heavy transmission shifter into drive. The old Volvo lurched forward, its tires spinning briefly on the wet asphalt before catching grip. She didn't bother turning on the headlights. She gunned the engine, cutting straight across the empty parking spaces, aiming for the dealership exit. Dean's truck engine turned over with a heavy diesel rattle. His headlights flared to life, illuminating the curtain of freezing rain. He put the truck in gear and started rolling toward the exit lane. Vivian jammed her foot on the brake and ripped the steering wheel hard to the left. The Volvo slid the heavy rear end fishtailing on the slick tarmac, coming to a violent halt directly across the exit lane. She was blocking him completely. Dean slammed on his brakes. The heavy Ford shuddered, stopping just 3 feet from the Volvo's passenger door. The blast of his high beams blinded her, washing the interior of her car in harsh white light. Vivian threw her door open and stepped out into the freezing rain. She didn't bother pulling her coat closed. The cold hit her like a physical blow, instantly soaking through her thin sweater. She marched straight toward the blinding headlights of the truck. Dean rolled down his window. The smell of cheap tobacco, wet dog, and diesel fumes rolled out of the cab. His face was a mask of exhausted frustration. "Move the car, Vivian," he said. His voice was flat, carrying a heavy weight of exhaustion that hadn't been there a few minutes ago. "No." Vivian stepped right up to the driver's side door, grabbing the rusted edge of the open window frame. The metal was freezing. "You fixed my car. You don't get to just walk away. I attached a ground wire. It took 30 seconds. Consider it a freebie." Dean didn't look at her eyes. He stared straight ahead at the rain hitting his windshield. "Get out of the rain. You're going to catch pneumonia." "I don't accept charity." Vivian snapped her voice, cutting through the heavy idle of the diesel engine. I pay for services rendered. What's your hourly rate? Dean finally turned his head. The yellow streetlights cast deep, harsh shadows across his face, highlighting the deep lines around his eyes and the grey creeping into his stubble. He looked at her expensive soaked wool coat, then up at her face. The cynical edge returned to his gaze. My hourly rate, Dean let out a hollow laugh. You want to write me a check, Viv, want to ease your conscience. I saw you on the cover of Forbes last month at the grocery store checkout. I know what you are now. You don't owe me anything. We were different people back then. I am the exact same person, Vivian said, her grip tightening on the doorframe until her fingers went white. I just have a better bank account. You saved my life 20 years ago, Dean, and tonight you stopped me from being stranded. Give me a goddamn invoice. I don't have a piece of paper, Dean said, his jaw clenching. His pride was a physical barrier between them, thick and impenetrable. From the passenger seat, a small voice cut through the tension. Dad, I'm cold. Vivian shifted her gaze. The little girl Maya was shivering in her oversized pink jacket, her small hands clutching the edges of a frayed seatbelt. The truck's heater was blowing cold air. The blower motor sounded like it was dying, making an awful rhythmic squeaking noise. Vivian's chest tightened. She looked back at Dean. The defiance in his eyes had cracked, replaced instantly by the panic of a parent who couldn't provide warmth. Vivian changed tactics. The aggressive CEO vanished. She leaned closer to the window, lowering her voice. Your blower motor bearings are shot, Vivian said quietly. And you're leaking coolant from the firewall. Heater core. Dean blinked, caught off guard by the mechanical assessment. Yeah, bypassed it last week so it wouldn't flood the cab. Haven't had the time to pull the dash apart to fix it. So your daughter is sitting in a freezing truck, Vivian said, stating it not as an insult, but as a tactical fact. My car has a heater that works. I'm following you to wherever your shop is. I'm not asking. Drive. Before Dean could argue, Vivian let go of the door, turned her back on him, and walked swiftly back to the idling Volvo. She climbed in, slammed the door and shifted into reverse, clearing the exit lane. She sat there, the engine humming, waiting. Dean stared at her through the rain for a long, heavy moment. He shook his head, put the truck in gear, and turned out onto the dark highway. Vivian pulled in right behind his taillights, the heat of the Volvo wrapping around her shivering body like a blanket. They drove for 20 minutes, leaving the manicured, brightly lit coastal highway behind. The scenery shifted from glass-fronted tech offices to decaying industrial parks. The streetlights here were either broken or flickering with sickly orange sodium light. The rain turned the pothole-riddled streets into black mirrors. Dean's truck turned down a narrow alleyway, flanked by chain-link fences, topped with rusted barbed wire. He pulled up to a massive corrugated steel roll-up door, set into a crumbling brick warehouse. The paint on the door was peeling in long grey strips. Vivian parked the Volvo next to a pile of stacked wooden pallets. She cut the engine. The silence was immediate and heavy. Dean unlocked a heavy padlock on a side door and pushed it open. He carried Maya inside, the little girl having fallen asleep against his shoulder during the drive. Vivian followed, stepping over a threshold, slick with old oil. Inside, the air was dense. It smelled of raw kerosene, damp concrete, and the sharp metallic tang of welding slag. Dean reached out and flipped a heavy breaker switch. A row of fluorescent tubes flickered on overhead, humming loudly. Half the bulbs were dead. The space was massive, but it felt claustrophobic. It wasn't a working garage. It was a graveyard. A half-dismantled sedan sat on cinder blocks in the corner. Shelves made of bowing plywood were stacked high with unlabeled cardboard boxes and greasy transmission casings. In the center of the room sat a massive red snap-on tool chest. It was the only clean, well-maintained object in the entire building. Dean laid Maya down gently on a battered faux leather couch in a corner office, partitioned by dirty plexiglass. He pulled a heavy, remarkably clean, moving blanket from a shelf and tucked it around her. He plugged in a small, radiant space heater, aiming the glowing orange coils toward the couch. Vivian stood in the center of the concrete floor, water still dripping from her coat. She took it all in. The sheer desperation of the space made her skin crawl. It wasn't just poor. It was drowning. Dean walked out of the office, pulling the door shut so the noise wouldn't wake his daughter. He walked over to a workbench, cluttered with engine valves, and picked up a shop rag, wiping rain from his face. "It's not much of a waiting room," Dean said, his voice flat. He pointed to an overturned plastic bucket. "Take a seat. I'll make coffee. It's instant." "I'll stand," Vivian said. She walked over to the massive red tool chest, running her fingers lightly over the smooth painted metal. "You were going to open a real shop, a big one. You showed me the blueprints in the shelter cafeteria." Dean stopped wiping his hands. He tossed the rag onto the bench. He grabbed a battered electric kettle and filled it from a utility sink that dripped a steady rhythm against the stainless steel basin. "Blueprints are cheap," Dean muttered, turning his back to her. "Reality costs money. You were the best mechanic on the East Side." Vivian pressed, ignoring his deflection. "People waited weeks to get their cars in your driveway." "What happened, Dean?" The kettle began to hiss. Dean kept his back to her, staring at the peeling paint above the sink. The muscles in his neck were tight, cording under his skin. "Life happened," he said. The gravel in his voice thickened. "Maya's mother got sick. Pancreatic. We didn't have insurance. By the time they found it, it was everywhere." Vivian stopped breathing for a second. The cold concrete floor seemed to drop away. "Dean, Don't," Dean interrupted, spinning around. His eyes were wide, burning with a mix of grief and deeply buried anger. "Don't do the pity thing. I can't stomach it. I took out loans to pay for the chemo. Predatory lenders. Title loans on my house, my tow truck, my tools. She died anyway." He turned back to the sink, dumping 2 spoonfuls of cheap instant coffee into 2 mismatched ceramic mugs. He poured the boiling water, the cheap coffee crystals foaming angrily. After she passed, the debt collectors came. Dean continued his voice, dropping to a monotonous drone, the sound of a man reciting a nightmare he'd lived 1,000 times. "They took the house. They took the tow truck. I managed to hide this tool chest and a few basics. Found this warehouse on a sublease. Now I do mobile repairs, off-the-books jobs, scrapping by." He walked over and handed Vivian a mug. It was scalding hot, the ceramic burning her freezing hands. She welcomed the pain. It anchored her. "Why were you buying parts from Bryce at Apex Motors?" Vivian asked, taking a sip. The coffee tasted like copper and burnt dirt. "That dealership charges a 50% markup on wholesale," Dean laughed bitterly, taking a heavy drink from his own mug. "Because the company that owns Apex Motors' Strand Automotive Group bought up all my medical debt from the loan sharks. They put a lien on my business license. I can't buy parts directly from distributors anymore because my credit is red-flagged. If I want OEM parts, I have to buy them through Strand's dealerships. They overcharge me. I have to overcharge my mobile clients, and I lose the business. They're slowly choking me to death." Vivian lowered her mug. The gears in her mind, the cold, calculating machinery that made her a billionaire, slammed into overdrive. The exhaustion vanished. Strand Automotive Group. Vivian repeated, slowly testing the weight of the syllables on her tongue. "They own the debt." "Yeah. And this warehouse," Dean said, looking around the bleak, damp space. "I'm 2 months behind on rent. Bryce was rubbing it in my face tonight. They're going to evict me at the end of the month, turn this place into a storage facility for their luxury inventory. Dean sat down on an overturned cinder block, suddenly looking incredibly small. The broad-shouldered man who had fearlessly reached into a boiling engine bay was entirely defeated by a piece of paper. "I don't know what I'm going to do about Maya," Dean whispered, burying his face in his rough, grease-stained hands. "I can't take her back to the shelter, Viv. I just can't do it." Vivian stood in the dim, flickering light, staring at the man who had kept her from freezing to death. She felt a dangerous, terrifying calm wash over her. It was the same calm she felt before she dismantled a rival corporation in the boardroom. She walked over, set her coffee mug down on the workbench, and pulled a sleek, matte black smartphone from her coat pocket. "You're not going to a shelter," Vivian said. Her voice wasn't gentle. It was the voice of a CEO declaring war. "And you're not paying another dime to Strand Automotive." Dean looked up, frowning. "Viv, stop. You can't just write a check to make this go away. They'll just hit me with early termination fees and legal costs. They own the paper." "I know," Vivian said, typing rapidly on her screen. "I'm not going to write a check, Dean. I'm going to ruin them." The morning sun cut violently through the floor-to-ceiling windows of the Taylor Logistics boardroom on the 44th floor. The light was blinding, reflecting off the polished mahogany table and the brushed steel carafes of artisanal Ethiopian coffee. Vivian sat at the head of the table. She was wearing a perfectly tailored navy blue suit, her hair pulled back into a severe, flawless knot. To the 6 executives sitting around the table, she looked like her usual, impenetrable self. They didn't know she hadn't slept. They didn't know the faint, chemical smell of kerosene was still trapped in her nasal passages, or that beneath her silk blouse, her skin still felt the damp chill of a concrete floor. Moving on to Q3 projections. David, her chief financial officer, droned on. He clicked a remote and a sterile bar graph appeared on the massive wall monitor. "Fuel costs are up 4%. But our automated routing algorithms have mitigated the margin loss. If we squeeze our regional subcontractors by another 2% on their quarterly renewals, we should see a net positive." Vivian stared at the graph. She wasn't seeing numbers. She was seeing Dean Gallagher's scarred, oil-stained hands burying themselves in his face. She was seeing a little girl shivering under a moving blanket. "If we squeeze our regional subcontractors..." Vivian blinked. The corporate jargon which she had lived and breathed for a decade suddenly sounded distinctly like violence. "Stop," Vivian said. The word wasn't loud, but it cut through the room like a gunshot. David froze his thumb, hovering over the presentation remote. The other 5 executives stiffened in their ergonomic chairs, their eyes darting to Vivian. "Ma'am," David asked nervously, "is there an issue with the fuel projections?" "I don't care about the fuel projections right now," Vivian said, leaning forward and resting her elbows on the mahogany wood. She looked to her right, to a man sitting slightly away from the table in a leather armchair. His name was Arthur. He didn't wear a suit. He wore a dark charcoal turtleneck and a blazer. His official title was Head of Acquisitions, but internally everyone knew Arthur was the hammer Vivian used to break things that wouldn't bend. "Arthur," Vivian said, "I asked you to look into a company at 4 a.m. this morning, Strand Automotive Group." Arthur sat up, opening a thin black leather folio on his lap. "I did, Vivian. It's a mid-sized regional conglomerate. They own 14 luxury dealerships across the tri-state area. Apex Motors is their flagship. Who owns them? A private equity firm out of Chicago holds a 60% stake, but the operational CEO and founder is a man named Richard Strand. Heavy leverage. They aggressively buy up subprime auto debt and medical liens, using them to force foreclosures on commercial real estate. It's a dirty, high-yield strategy. David, the CFO, cleared his throat. Vivian, with respect, Strand Automotive has nothing to do with our logistics pipeline. Why are we discussing a regional dealership group? Because, Vivian said, her voice dropping to a terrifyingly quiet register, I have decided I want to buy them. The boardroom fell dead silent. You could hear the faint, high-pitched hum of the LED lights. Buy them, David stammered, adjusting his glasses. Vivian, we are a global freight and supply chain company. We don't deal in retail automotive or subprime debt. The board will never approve the capital expenditure for an unrelated acquisition. I am the majority shareholder. Vivian stated, her eyes locking on to David with the intensity of a predator. I don't need the board's permission. Arthur, what is their weak point? Arthur didn't flinch at the change in business strategy. He flipped a page in his folio. Their supply chain, specifically their parts distribution. To maintain their profit margins on repairs, Strand imports 70% of their high-end OEM components through a single shipping channel from Germany. If those parts are delayed, their service centers stall. If their service centers stall, they default on their operational covenants, with the private equity firm backing them. A cold, razor-thin smile touched Vivian's lips. It was a smile that had terrified seasoned Wall Street veterans. Taylor Logistics controlled 40% of the commercial maritime freight arriving at the eastern seaboard. Arthur, Vivian said smoothly. I want you to initiate a priority tier restructuring for our customs processing at the port. Any shipping containers flagged for Strand Automotive Group are to be moved to the lowest priority queue. Subject them to randomized comprehensive safety audits. Hold them in customs. David looked horrified. Vivian, you're talking about intentionally bottlenecking millions of dollars of their inventory. That's bordering on antitrust. It's a randomized safety audit, David, Vivian said, not breaking eye contact. We are simply committing to the highest standards of import security. It might take weeks to clear their containers. Perhaps a month. They'll bleed cash. Arthur noted a faint hint of amusement in his voice. Their service bays will back up. They won't be able to turn over their inventory. Exactly, Vivian said. And when they start bleeding, their private equity backers will panic. They will look for a quick injection of liquidity. When they do, Arthur, I want you to set up a shell company. Approach Richard Strand and offer to buy his entire portfolio of distressed debt and commercial liens at 50 cents on the dollar. Arthur nodded, jotting a single note in his folio. Consider it done. We can have their supply chain strangled by Tuesday. Good. Vivian stood up, buttoning her suit jacket. The meeting was over. The executives scrambled to gather their tablets and papers, desperate to get out of the room before the temperature dropped any further. As they filed out, Vivian walked over to the floor-to-ceiling window. She looked down at the sprawling city below, a concrete grid of millions of people fighting to survive. For 20 years, she had built her fortress of wealth to ensure she would never be cold again. She had told herself she was being practical. But as she touched the glass, remembering the grease on Dean's knuckles and the shattered pride in his eyes, she realized the truth. She hadn't just survived the cold. She had become it. Not anymore, she thought, watching the tiny ant-like cars inch along the highway far below. Hold on, Dean. I'm coming to level the block. 14 days later, the sterile, citrus-scented air of the Apex Motor Service Center smelled overwhelmingly of stale sweat and panic. The pristine floor was scuffed with the heavy footprints of furious customers. 7 high-end European imports sat suspended on hydraulic lifts, their underbellies exposed, gathering a fine layer of dust. In the center of the room, the phones on the marble podium rang with a relentless, shrill cadence that drilled into the skull. Bryce looked terrible. His tailored suit jacket was discarded over a chair. The knot of his silk tie was yanked loose, and a sheen of frantic perspiration glued his heavily gelled hair to his forehead. He gripped a phone receiver to his ear, his voice tight, attempting to placate a local plastic surgeon whose imported coupe had been sitting in Bay 3 for over a week. "I understand, Dr. Orris. The supply chain is completely jammed. It's a customs embargo at the port," Bryce stammered, rubbing his temples. "I have 3 pallets of alternators and transmission control modules sitting in a shipping container, and they won't release them. I cannot fix your car without the computer." Kyle, the spotless master technician, leaned against a toolbox, scrolling through his phone. He hadn't turned a wrench in 3 days. There was nothing to turn. Outside, the heavy rain had given way to a bitter, bone-dry winter chill. A matte black armor-plated SUV glided to a halt in the VIP drop-off lane. The driver, a broad-shouldered man wearing an earpiece, stepped out and opened the rear door. Vivian stepped onto the pavement. She wore a tailored charcoal trench coat over a high-collared black silk blouse. She carried a slim leather briefcase. She didn't look like a soaking wet stray asking for charity anymore. She looked like an executioner. The glass automatic doors slid open with a soft hiss. The noise of the ringing phones hit Vivian immediately, a chaotic symphony she found deeply satisfying. She walked across the porcelain tiles, the sharp clack-clack of her heels echoing above the din. She bypassed the waiting line of 2 irate customers and walked directly up to the marble podium. Bryce held up a finger, glaring at her while still speaking into the phone. "Ma'am, the line is behind the stanchions. I will be with you when I—" He stopped. His eyes flicked over her tailored coat, her immaculate hair, and finally settled on her face. A flicker of recognition sparked behind his bloodshot eyes, followed instantly by utter confusion. He remembered the face. He remembered the rusted Volvo. But the geometry of power had completely shifted, short-circuiting his brain. "I need to speak to your regional director, Bryce," Vivian said. Her voice wasn't raised, but it carried a deadly, absolute calm that immediately silenced the irate customers standing behind her. My director." Bryce lowered the phone, slowly hanging up on the surgeon. "Who are you?" "My name is Vivian Taylor." Kyle dropped his phone. It clattered loudly against the steel toolbox. He stared at her, his jaw slackening. Everyone in the tri-state area knew the name Taylor. It was plastered on the side of 10,000 freight trucks. It owned the ports. I don't understand." Bryce swallowed hard, his Adam's apple, bobbing nervously. "You were here 2 weeks ago, with that junk car. A 1990 Volvo 240. Yes." Vivian rested her hands on the cold marble of the podium. "I'm here about your inventory. Or rather, your lack of it." Bryce's face drained of color. He looked toward the windows, toward the port 50 miles away. The realization hit him with the physical force of a sledgehammer. The catastrophic logistics failure that was currently bankrupting the dealership wasn't a random customs audit. It was a targeted assassination. "You," Bryce breathed, his voice trembling. "You stopped our containers." "I am a firm believer in rigorous import safety," Vivian said, her expression entirely unreadable. "I've been reviewing Strand Automotive's quarterly filings. A 60% drop in service revenue in 14 days. Your private equity backers triggered a margin call yesterday. Your CEO, Richard Strand, was forced to liquidate his distressed debt portfolio this morning to cover the operational shortfall." Bryce grabbed the edges of the podium to keep his knees from buckling. The air in the room felt violently thin. Vivian tapped her leather briefcase against the marble. "Your dealership is bleeding out on the floor, Bryce. But that isn't why I came." She leaned in, dropping her voice so only he could hear it. She smelled of expensive, understated perfume and cold winter air. I came to tell you that you are standing in a graveyard, Vivian whispered, and the next time you see a man with grease on his hands, you will treat him with the respect that built this country. Have a terrible afternoon. Vivian turned on her heel and walked out through the sliding doors. She didn't look back as the phones behind her began to ring again, echoing off the glass like a death knell. The alleyway was a tunnel of frozen shadows. The temperature hovered in the single digits, causing the exhaust from Vivian's idling SUV to billow in thick white clouds. She told her driver to wait in the car. She pulled the collar of her trench coat up against the biting wind and walked toward the corrugated steel door of the warehouse. The padlock was gone. A heavy rhythmic scraping sound echoed from inside, accompanied by a sharp chemical smell of oxidized metal and cutting fluid. Vivian pushed the side door open. The warehouse was colder than she remembered. The radiant space heater in the plexiglass office was turned off. Maya was nowhere to be seen. In the center of the dim, cavernous room, Dean was bent over a massive rusted brake drum on the concrete floor. He was using an angle grinder. A shower of brilliant violet orange sparks rained across his heavy leather apron and work boots. He didn't hear her come in over the screaming RPMs of the grinder. Vivian stood in the shadows watching him. His movements were brutal but precise. He leaned his entire body weight into the tool, muscling the spinning disc through a seized bolt. The muscles in his forearms strained against the dirty canvas of his sleeves. He wasn't just working, he was punishing himself. He was a man trying to physically grind away the heavy, suffocating weight of a world that was crushing him. Vivian stepped forward, her heels clicking on the concrete. Dean caught the movement in his peripheral vision. He snapped his thumb off the trigger. The grinder whined down to a heavy metallic silence. The sudden quiet in the warehouse felt deafening. He pushed his safety glasses up onto his forehead. A ring of clean skin surrounded his eyes, a stark contrast to the thick layer of black carbon dust coating the rest of his face. He stared at her, his chest heaving. He looked at her expensive coat. He looked at the leather briefcase in her hand. Maya is at her aunt's house tonight, Dean said gruffly, his voice rough from inhaling metal dust. Too cold in here. I told you I was going to fix this, Dean, Vivian said. She walked over to his immaculate red tool chest. She unclasped her briefcase. The lock snapped with a sharp, expensive click. She pulled out a thick manila envelope and dropped it onto the red metal. It landed with a heavy, muted thud. Dean didn't move. He stared at the envelope as if it were a bomb. What is that? It's a transfer of deed and a lien release, Vivian said, her voice steady. I bought Strand Automotive's distressed debt portfolio this morning. I own the paper on this warehouse. I own the title loan on your tow truck, and I own the medical debt. Inside that envelope is a zero balance statement and the deed to this building. It's yours, free and clear. Dean slowly lowered the heavy grinder to the floor. The metal clanged against the concrete. He took a step toward the tool chest, his eyes locked on the envelope. He didn't reach for it. He wiped a greasy gloved hand across his mouth. The silence stretched, pulling taut like a guitar string on the verge of snapping. Vivian expected relief. She expected him to collapse, to cry, to thank her. Instead, Dean let out a low, humorless scoff. He looked up at her, and his eyes were completely dead. You bought it, Dean repeated. I bought it, Vivian confirmed. They're done. They can't touch you anymore. You bought me. Dean's voice began to rise, a dark, heavy anger bleeding into his tone. He pulled off his heavy work gloves and threw them onto the workbench. You didn't fix anything, Viv. You just changed who holds the leash. Vivian flinched, genuinely caught off guard. The impenetrable CEO armor cracked. That's not fair. I am forgiving the debt. I am giving you the deed. I didn't ask for your charity. Dean roared, the sound echoing off the high steel beams of the warehouse. He closed the distance between them, pointing a scarred, grease-stained finger at the envelope. I am a mechanic. I fix things with my hands. I pay for my life with my sweat. You think you can waltz in here in a $5,000 coat wave, a magic wand, and erase my pride? You think wiping away my wife's medical debt with pocket change makes you a savior? I am trying to help you, Vivian yelled back, the polished corporate facade shattering completely. Her heart hammered against her ribs. The cold air burned her throat. They were going to evict you. Dean, they were going to throw you and your daughter onto the street. Do you know what that feels like? Because I do. Dean stopped. His chest rose and fell heavily. I was 22. Vivian said, her voice shaking raw and vicious. She wasn't a billionaire right now. She was a terrified girl in a rusted car. I was freezing to death in the back seat of a Volvo behind a shelter. I was invisible. The world walked past me every single day and hoped I would just die quietly so they wouldn't have to look at me. But you looked at me. You didn't ask for a deposit. You didn't run my credit. You stripped a wire with your teeth and you gave me back my life. Vivian reached out and shoved the manila envelope across the slick surface of the tool chest. It slid to a halt right in front of him. You saved me. Vivian whispered, a single tear cutting a hot track down her cold cheek. She swiped it away aggressively, hating the weakness. I didn't buy you, Dean. I bought the chains they had around your neck, and I am breaking them, because no one deserves to freeze. Dean looked down at the envelope. His hands were trembling slightly. The deep, jagged lines of exhaustion on his face seemed to deepen in the harsh fluorescent light. The anger drained out of him all at once, leaving behind a hollow, terrifying exhaustion. He rested his hands on the edge of the tool chest, bowing his head. For a long time, the only sound in the warehouse was the dripping of the leaky utility sink. I can't just take it. Viv, Dean said, his voice cracking barely more than a whisper. The pride was still there, but it was bruised, vulnerable. A man is nothing if he doesn't carry his own weight. If I take this, I didn't earn it. I'm just a charity case. Vivian looked at him. She looked at his scarred hands, the absolute competence radiating from his posture even in defeat. Her mind, perfectly trained to assess assets and leverage, saw exactly what she needed to see. She didn't pity him. She respected him. You're right, Vivian said, her voice shifting, the tremor vanishing. The CEO returned, but this time not as a predator, as a partner. You can't just take it. You have to earn it. Dean looked up, his brow furrowing in confusion. Taylor Logistics operates a fleet of 4,000 heavy-duty freight trucks, Vivian said, stepping away from the tool chest and crossing her arms. I currently contract our regional fleet maintenance out to 3 corporate service centers. They overcharge us for labor. They use substandard aftermarket parts, and they treat my trucks like numbers on a spreadsheet. They don't know how to listen to the metal. Dean blinked, slowly straightening up. I am firing all 3 of them on Monday. Vivian continued, the cold, calculating fire returning to her eyes. I am establishing an in-house fleet maintenance division. I need a director of mechanics, someone who doesn't use a tablet to diagnose a blown gasket, someone who can run a massive facility, hire a crew, and keep my trucks moving. Dean stared at her. You're offering me a job. I'm offering you an empire, Vivian corrected her. You take this building, you clear the title on your tow truck. We use this warehouse as your temporary staging ground while we build out a state-of-the-art repair hub. Your starting salary will be $250,000 a year, plus performance bonuses tied to our fleet uptime. She pointed to the manila envelope. The cost of this debt will be deducted from your bonuses over the next 5 years. You're going to pay me back every single penny, Dean. With interest. Dean looked at the envelope. Then he looked at Vivian. The dead, hollow look in his eyes was gone. In its place, a slow, cautious ember of hope began to burn. The mechanic's brain, dormant and suppressed by debt, began to turn over. 4,000 trucks, Dean muttered, rubbing the heavy stubble on his jaw. You'd need a central hub, at least 50 bays, heavy hydraulic lifts, an automated parts inventory system. Write up the proposal, Vivian said, a genuine, undeniable smile breaking across her face. Have it on my desk by Wednesday. Dean let out a long, shuddering breath. He reached out and placed his scarred hand flat on top of the manila envelope. He didn't pull it toward himself. He just grounded himself against it. I don't own a suit, Dean said, looking down at his oil-stained canvas pants. Don't buy one, Vivian said softly. I have enough suits in my boardroom. I need a man who knows how to get his hands dirty. 6 months later, the smell of kerosene and damp concrete was gone. The warehouse had been completely gutted and retrofitted. Massive skylights had been cut into the corrugated roof, flooding the polished epoxy floor with bright, natural spring sunlight. 6 heavy-duty hydraulic lifts stood in a neat row, supporting the massive dark blue cabs of Taylor Logistics freight trucks. The air smelled of clean motor oil, citrus degreaser, and freshly brewed high-quality coffee. In the back corner, enclosed by a soundproof glass wall, was a bright, climate-controlled office. Inside, Maya sat at a large desk, her legs swinging over the edge of the chair, drawing violently colorful dinosaurs on a dry erase board. Dean Gallagher walked out of the parts room, carrying a clipboard. He was wearing a clean, dark blue uniform shirt. His name was embroidered over the left breast pocket, right above the Taylor Logistics corporate logo. His hair was trimmed, his beard shaped, but his hands were still scarred, still deeply stained with the permanent tattoo of a lifetime of hard labor. He didn't walk like a man carrying the world on his shoulders anymore. He walked with the heavy, grounded stride of a man who owned his space. He walked over to bay number 1. There wasn't a freight truck on this lift. Instead, sitting proudly in the center of the bay, was the 1990 Volvo 240 Estate. It had been entirely steam-cleaned. The oxidized paint had been painstakingly buffed, restoring the original deep crimson gloss. The engine bay was open. The thick layer of sludge was gone, revealing gleaming silver intake runners and a perfectly routed, brand-new wiring harness. Vivian leaned against the fender, holding a ceramic mug of coffee. She wore a simple white linen shirt, her sleeves rolled up to her elbows, and dark jeans. She looked remarkably relaxed, a stark contrast to the ruthless titan she was in the boardroom. Okay, Dean said, tossing the clipboard onto a rolling tool cart. He wiped his hands on a clean microfiber towel. New motor mounts, polyurethane. They'll outlive you. We completely rebuilt the cylinder head, machined the block, and replaced the entire wiring harness. No more ballpoint pen springs in the ignition relay. Are you sure? Vivian smiled, tracing a finger over the smooth, clean metal of the quarter panel. The pen spring had character. The pen spring was a fire hazard. Dean shot back, though a warm grin broke through his gruff tone. He leaned against the car next to her, looking down at the immaculate engine bay. It runs like a sewing machine now. It'll give you another 300,000 miles. Vivian took a sip of her coffee. The bitter warmth grounded her. She looked around the massive humming facility. Mechanics in blue uniforms were moving efficiently around the trucks. The sound of pneumatic air tools echoed sharply, but it wasn't a chaotic noise. It was the rhythm of a well-oiled machine. You did good here, Dean, Vivian said softly. The fleet uptime is up 12% this quarter. The board is thrilled. Don't care about the board, Dean grunted, crossing his massive arms. He looked at her, the spring sunlight catching the silver creeping into his hair. I care that the trucks are safe. The drivers are getting home to their kids. Vivian nodded slowly. She looked down at her own hands. They were smooth, manicured, unscarred. They were the hands of a woman who directed money on screens. But as she stood next to the Volvo, next to the man who had pulled her out of the abyss, she felt a profound sense of connection to the grease and the grit. "I'm keeping it," Vivian said suddenly. Dean raised an eyebrow. "The car, yes." Vivian looked at the heavy steel steering wheel through the windshield. The duct tape was gone, replaced by a fresh leather wrap. "My CFO told me I should donate it to a museum. Said it was a good PR story. Billionaire keeps her first car. But I'm not doing that." "Good," Dean said. "Cars are meant to be driven. Metal rots when it sits." Vivian turned to him. The ghosts of 20 years ago, the freezing nights, the terror of eviction, the absolute certainty that the world was a cold, unfeeling void, finally felt quiet. They weren't gone. They would never be completely gone. But they were no longer behind the steering wheel. "I'll bring it in for an oil change every 3,000 miles, Vivian said, a slight tease in her voice. "Do I get a discount?" Dean scoffed, picking up his clipboard. "You own the building, Viv, but labor is labor. I charge standard shop rates." Vivian laughed. It was a bright, genuine sound that echoed beautifully off the high steel ceiling. She reached out and placed her hand over his scarred knuckles. A brief, grounding touch of absolute solidarity. "I wouldn't have it any other way," she said. Dean smiled, a real, unburdened smile that reached his eyes. He tapped the roof of the Volvo twice with his knuckles. The metal rang out solid and true. "Turn the key," Dean said quietly. "Let's hear her purr. We spend our entire lives building armor to protect ourselves from the cold, only to realize that the armor is exactly what keeps out the warmth." Vivian and Dean proved that sometimes you don't need a new engine. You just need someone who knows how to listen to the metal and find the broken connection. Have you ever had someone pull you out of the dark when you had nothing left to give? Let us know your story in the comments below. Drop a like to support the channel. And subscribe so we can keep bringing you stories that matter.